All right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be the final lecture, chapter 17. This is by Harvey Sapolsky, and this one is about hegemony in Pax Americana. I'm kind of surprised they brought up the concept of hegemony so late because it's so important in international relations. So I'm glad we're covering it here. Okay, section one. What is the definition of hegemony? They define it as actors that are noticeably above others in military and economic terms, right? There have often been regional hegemons. Think the Roman Empire, arguably South Africa in the African realm, China right now in the South Pacific. And we were bipolar with the USSR and the United States from basically 1950 until the fall of the wall. And then around 1989, 1990-ish, it became, at least theorists say, a hegemon, a singular hegemonic system with the U.S. as the world's first global hegemon. Okay, section two, from isolation to global superpower. We got to remember contextually and historically, the U.S. Was largely isolationist from our inception until the World War II period-ish, um, except the Caribbean, right? We did have sort of the Monroe Doctrine and these other doctrines about this is our backyard, don't come and fuck with us. So we did get involved in the Caribbean, especially with like the Spanish War, the Cuban, these sorts of things. But we were largely isolationist. George Washington famously said, alliances can be tricky, they can get us into more trouble than we want. Numerous presidents after that were very isolationist. We did not join the League of Nations post World War II, even though it was sort of the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson. But the U.S. Congress refused to join. So we really weren't a sort of a global force until sort of post World War II. And there's a couple reasons for this. The main reason is that the U.S. was the last man standing, not only militarily but also economically. Right, the the Second World War devastated the globe. Europe was in shambles. China and Japan were both in shambles. The only operating factories on the globe at that point basically were American factories. And we also had this sort of this network of global military bases across the planet because of World War II. And we made a conscious decision post World War II to keep those operative, right? Not to withdraw from these global positions. Germany, Turkey, the Philippines, Japan, not Japan at the time, but surrounding Japan, etc. And so the United States was in a very fortunate position, not only because we got into World War II pretty late, right? There were big arguments about whether we should get into the Second World War, because let's be real, there were a lot of supporters of Hitler in the United States. We have a history of white supremacy in this country. And there's always going to be a portion of the population that supports that sort of thing. And so it was very touchy politically until December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, which was sort of the impetus for us getting into the war. But until that point, we were very staunchly opposed to getting involved, basically. And, there were reasons, not only blood and money, but also political ideology. And so it was politically touchy as well. Um, Again, we had the only sort of functioning factories on the planet at that point, so we are providing the whole rest of the world with basically any goods. And of course, we used the Marshall Plan to try to rebuild Europe and help them rebuild their infrastructure, their factories, etc. But during the interim period for 5 to 10 years, I mean, the U.S. was just pumping out goods. Let's see. I also want you to know that we took sort of post World War II, we took this very heavy realist perspective, right? Yes, we joined the UN. Yes, we joined NATO and others. But for the most part, we are a very, very realist driven um, uh, nation. Um, and not only sort of philosophically and ideologically, but also the leaders of the country, right? From Eisenhower and then moving into our sort of nuclear weapons program and mutually assured destruction to Henry Kissinger, who was a high level and even eventually Secretary of State realist, right? And he recently died, I guess, about a year or two ago. But these are the main philosophical and strategic leaders in our country during this time, and so we took a very, very realist perspective. Um, with a touch of ideology, right? Realism mixed with anti-communism, right? Especially post 1950ish or so, when the USSR starts to, push its way into the international scene, is trying to spread itself to Cuba, South American countries, parts of Africa, etc. Right? Um, given the structure of the international economy in the post-World War II period, the U.S. was really able to institute its own rules, right? Yes, we will help you. Yes, we will give you free trade agreements, but you got to do it the way we tell you to do it, right? And so a lot of this comes down to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. Bretton Woods was a very, very important moment for the modernization of the economic system across the planet. Um, we moved toward this sort of U.S. gold-backed currency system in 1944. We later moved away from this 25 years later or so in 1971 under Nixon, when we moved to the sort of floating regime, the floating currencies. Um, and so that will change later. But we also created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, as it's called. We created the IMF and the World Bank, which of course have been pretty highly criticized during its existence, right? We created the UN and basically gave ourselves a permanent Security Council seat with veto voting power, right? One of the five. We ensured that the UN was headquartered in America, in New York City. So that gave us sort of cultural power as well. Um, let's see. And also the creation and arguably the complete leadership of NATO, right? The North American Treaty Organization. Um, so we established a very powerful role, and we wrote most of the rules for the global trade and the global military system. Okay, section 3 on Global Watch. The US spends about today 35 to 40% of the entire world's military budget, right? So if you took every dollar spent on military expenditures across the globe, the US makes up about 35 to 40% of that, depending on the source, right? China is a distant second at about 12.5% of the global military expenditures. The US generally has a high level technological superiority, but warfare changes quickly in the modern era, as we're finding out with the Ukrainian and the Israeli Hamas wars. And the US is relatively slow at making changes to their military systems. And this isn't even my suggestion, this is the military's own admission. Numerous military admirals, generals, researchers, etc., say, we need to figure out better ways to innovate, to spend, these sorts of things, right? And while the United States is generally technologically very superior, especially when it comes to air power, we have troubling numbers with our volunteer military, right? China has an enormous military, at least from a citizen standpoint, right? Whereas the United States has a very, very small military. Um, and the argument is that we'll ramp it up during war times. But this is kind of a concern inside the military too, is that we spend a whole lot of money on toys and don't really have enough troops to implement them, right? I would also point out that some other countries are starting to catch up technologically, right? China, while they can't really match the US technologically, there are certain areas where they are making massive improvements, especially in their missile technology, not only nuclear missiles, but also sort of just regular explosive missiles. And they are purported to have aircraft killer missiles, which would be pretty crazy because nobody's ever really been able to take down an aircraft carrier. But at least some I guess spying has shown that they have these pretty remarkable missiles that might be able to take out an aircraft carrier with one shot. Again, China is beefing up their nuclear capabilities and the number of nuclear warheads under their arsenal. They're trying to double it basically every 5 years or so. They are definitely catching up on drone warfare. The world is sort of learning that this is probably the future direction of modern warfare. It is remarkably cheap. They are really effective as long as you have the right training in place. And the US, from what I read, is kind of falling behind on this drone technology stuff. And then China also is really good and maybe even better than the United States at sort of signals intelligence and cyber warfare, right? Hacking, attacking infrastructure, shutting down banks, these sorts of things. Um, okay. I also want to point out that despite America's remarkable technological superiority generally against their adversaries, we have a pretty tenuous military record over our time, right? Korea was a draw at best. Vietnam was probably a loss. Somalia and Black Hawk Down in the 1990s was a complete disaster. Iraq One did accomplish its goal of protecting Kuwaiti land and oil, but they left Saddam in place under George Bush One in the early 90s. Iraq 2 was a mess. Things are arguably worse than they were before we went in there. Also, we lied about our reason to go to war with them when Colin Powell told the world we had 100% proof that they had weapons of mass destruction, and it later came out that they absolutely did not, and they were arguably in no way involved in 9/11. Afghanistan was probably a loss. We had a completely messy exit, and the Taliban is still in power there. And so, the US doesn't have a great military record over time. Um, Another point to be made is that democracies generally have a really difficult time maintaining long wars because they have to keep their citizens happy because of elections. And this arguably affects their approach to military fighting with a lot fewer sort of on the ground, street to street, home to home, person to person contacts, and much more reliance on airstrikes. But you can't win a war with airstrikes. You have to hold territory. And so, yes, airplanes can soften things up and they can do devastating damage, but you can't win a war with airplanes. Okay, section 4: a world full of free riders. This is a really important topic contemporarily, especially with NATO. I'm sorry, y'all. Um, over the last 15 years or so, especially under Trump, there has been a lot of pushback against NATO countries for not meeting their financial obligations. The NATO treaty says that countries must provide 2% of their GDP toward NATO expenditures, military expenditures, etc. Right? And Most of the developed nations in Europe do not meet those goals and have not met those goals for many, many, many decades. And so Trump really pushed them under his first term and said, look, we're going to just walk away if you don't fix this mess. The United States is tired of paying for your protection, right? We're not your daddy. You're supposed to pay in, right? And so there was a lot of concern that the US would walk away, which would devastate NATO. And so a lot of these countries have actually been pressured to up their expenditures, right? And not all of them are quite at that 2% level, but most of them are meeting that now. And many of them have gone beyond that, especially the ones that are close to sort of the Russian border, right? So Poland is up to like 4.5 or 5% of their GDP, and other countries are starting to exceed that 2% mark. Um, Let's see. Oh yeah, and then NATO's not the only problem either, right? We are heavy allies with Japan, South Korea, but they don't do much better either. They don't contribute a whole lot. They rely on the U.S. to protect them and to protect them with their nuclear shields and their sort of naval superiority. And so this is something that in modern times has really gotten a lot of pushback. And it's probably for the best, because it allows the United States to force some of the responsibility onto those countries. And they need to be meeting their obligations, right? Okay, that's all I've got for you. I really hope you liked the class. We're going to skip chapter 18. It was a strange chapter, I have to admit. There was some good stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but it was just really weird. Thank you so much for being here. Please fill out the I don't know, the questionnaire, the survey. I don't know how to improve these classes unless I get feedback. Um, and thank you so much for being here. I hope to see you all in the future. I wish we got to meet person to person. I wish I got to get to know y'all some, but this is just kind of the way it goes. So, again, thanks for being here. Have a wonderful day.